Welcome, friend. Another edition, another evening of Ask Prof. Welcome, friends, to another edition of Ask Prof. Wolff. Thank you for your patience, as we always have one or two glitches that come along with these live programs. I'm glad to be here again. I'm glad to have you all with me. But I want to start off by telling you that we have a special this evening, and that special is I'm going to be joined, I am already joined, by Jared Sexton, a prolific commentator on what is happening across the American landscape, and somebody who's been on Economic Update, our weekly program, and someone that I'm working with, and we're making an experiment in part this evening, doing this together so that we will alternate. I will answer a question, he will, and we'll go back and forth, and we'll be interested in your reactions to how this works. I want to remind you again, we begin with two questions that have been collected over the last week or two from people sending them in. We get quite a volume of those. And then we'll turn it over to you to put in your questions, and we will select whichever many we have time for and make this work as a collaborative activity between you and us. So let's begin. The first question we selected came from Louisa. And I want to read it to you because it's really important to get what Louisa has done here. Hello to everyone at Democracy at Work, and thank you for all you do. Well, let me interrupt and thank Louisa for being so kind and generous to open her question that way. And then she's very modest and says, I just have a quick question. And then she asks a doozy. In a communist society, resources would be allocated to each according to their needs. But how does society best determine that? In other words, how do we know who needs what and when? And a communist society would have no state, no classes, nor money. Would the people be given a type of voucher for their work? Okay, I want to respond to this, first of all, by congratulating Louisa for asking this question. And let me tell you why. For most of the last 75 years, the Cold War years, if you like, it has been taboo in the United States to think that there is anything above, beyond, better than capitalism. It's been impossible to ask the question. It's as though a taboo existed that literally banned people from having a conversation. I remember in my college classes, the professor either spending no time on any alternative to capitalism, or if a few minutes were spent, it was in order to dismiss everything else as either for capitalism and therefore of no interest anymore, or a silly fantasy that wouldn't work, or maybe was an evil plot of somebody like Stalin or something like that. No serious attention was paid to what it might mean to have a different economic system. So that's changing now. And Luisa's question is exactly part of it. She's putting it on the map in a very nice, matter-of-fact way to say, how would it work? So now let me try briefly to answer. Luisa's concept of communism, which is quite common, relies on a few very general ideas. For example, the famous to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. the notion that it's a community that draws on its members what they can give and gives to everybody what they need. And that is clearly not the way capitalism works. So it gives you at least a glimmer, but it is a very general statement. It meant as a kind of slogan, a kind of shorthand pointing in a certain direction. But in fact, it would have to be fleshed out, and that has been done. There's a huge literature around the world about how these alternative systems, some of them socialist, some of them communist, some of them calling themselves a whole lot of other things, communitarian, collectivist, and so on. The general answer I would give to her question is that needs would be decided democratically. And here's what I would mean as an example. The society would democratically decide what needs that we have as people are going to be provided collectively. Let me explain what I mean. Central Park in the middle of New York City is a wonderful park where literally in the course of the year, millions of people go. These people to look at the ducks on the pond, this one to have a picnic, that one to listen to music, the other one to smoke a cigar, whatever the myriad reasons. We don't buy a piece of the park. It's not a commodity. It is a collectively consumed resource. Public education is like that. There are a lot of things like that. And then there are other things which we consume individually, where we would need to be given a way to individually decide, do I want to buy this meal? Do I want to get that sweater? And so on. So the decision would have to be made, what do we provide collectively and what do we provide individually? And that would be a democratically debated and decided. Might be 50-50 split. I mean, let me give you another example, which my students have liked over the years. You could provide automobiles by letting each individual decide whether to buy one and which one to get, and then have them privately owned and consumed. Or you could have at the edge of every town and city a garage, a public garage, where cars were maintained in good condition. And when you needed one, you went and got it, used it. Sort of like using a piece of the lawn in Central Park. That would be a collective consumption. It's already happening with bicycles here in New York City, and rent-a-car is kind of halfway on the way to that kind of collective use of the automobile. And a communist society might go that way. Here's another question. It's not necessary for a communist society to have no money, for example. Louisa makes that comment about no money. I assume there would be some communist societies that would use money and some that wouldn't. And that leads me to a final point I want to make. We don't all agree on what the communist alternative is, and that's fine. We don't have to agree. There can be varieties of communism. I would expect them to be that way, as there are varieties of capitalism. For me, the crucial thing that I would like to end with is what I think makes it a communist society. And for me, the crucial thing is how you organize the production and distribution of the goods and services we need. We don't do it in the slave manner with masters and slaves. We don't do it in the feudal manner with lords and serfs. And we don't do it in the capitalist manner with employers and employees, precisely because that's a few people running the operation and controlling and giving orders to the mass of people. That isn't democratic. The crucial thing about the communist alternative is that it's changed. The factory, the office, the store becomes a place where people, one person, one vote, decide democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the fruits of their labor. That is a radically different way of organizing a society's production than we had had under capitalism. And it's in that direction that the explorations and the forms of communism will be worked out in the years ahead. Very important question to bring up, Louisa. Thank you for doing it.
Dr. Wolff, I'd like to add something real fast, because I think you couldn't have hit the nail more on the head. One of the problems that we've had is the inability to even have conversations or use an imagination about how things might happen. One of the ways that any of these conversations get shut down is the idea that a managed economy is somehow or another unmanageable. And instead, we have a capitalist managed economy where we manage booms and busts and basically everyone suffers. And what you brought up, I think, is really important. We already have these, I'm going to put heavy quotes around technological innovations that are all based on what you said. It's rent seeking that is actually what's done. It's people who buy a bunch of bikes or buy a bunch of scooters or a bunch of cars. And we create all these technological adaptations that are supposed to somehow or another make people's lives easier. And what we do is we don't pay attention to the fact that to make things better, we could potentially use the technologies or innovations, just not towards rent seeking and or subjugating people. I always like to push people towards looking towards the past. In past times when we were able to have these conversations or an imagination about what could be different, people say, well, how would a society like this work? How could we allocate resources? And I always say, go back and look at something like Cybersyn in Chile in the 1970s, which was an innovation before Salvador Allende was overthrown. And the US helped do this and destroyed this through economic warfare and subterfuge. The technologies that we see now, they're used towards rent seeking and also subjugation. They have been stifled in terms of how they might be used to make people's lives better, or how we might manage an economy, or how we might make sure that resources are handled democratically or fairly. And those things are there, but these conversations are consistently tamped down and destroyed, and any movement towards them are destroyed because that conversation, the one that you are so aptly and eloquently starting with, are dangerous. Because if you start to look at those alternatives, you start to realize like how unfair and how awful what we actually have right now are. So,
yeah, and I'm glad you added that because history is full of examples. People have tried to develop democratic, collective ways of producing goods and services in lots of different settings for thousands of years. It is now perhaps possible to really do it on a general social scale. But when people ask me for examples, I tell them in many parts of Europe, both in the Middle Ages and in modern society, there's an example where people get together and do not have employers and employees, but produce something. And one of the places is monasteries all over the world, where the nuns, if it's women, or the monks, if it's men, get together and collectively produce products of all kinds that keep the monastery going, that raise money for this religious institution. But when they figured out how to do the work, they didn't set up with owners and employees. None of that. They felt that was inconsistent with their religious beliefs, which raises a very interesting question, but we're going to go on to the next question. And Jared, I'm going to, because we have to cover and give a lot of people a chance, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't take over. Teresa's is the second question we chose over the interval. Maybe you can read it or summarize it and give your response.
Yeah, I really appreciated Teresa's question because I think this is a larger thing that we need to be thinking about as we move forward. Teresa asked about growing unionization in America and how globalism and the ability for companies to send jobs overseas as people are forming unions, how that might keep that momentum from growing, and how she refers to it as a, quote, self-defeating issue. And what might we be able to do about that? And I wanted to talk about this because this is something we need to think about. Globalism, I wanted to define very quickly, is a system that basically was a major gift to corporations and the wealthy. It created workarounds around regulations and oversight and unionization. It was something close to a death blow towards unionization because you don't have to stay in America. And on top of that, it created this system where any threat towards profit and growth could be, gone around. It basically created the entire outsourcing situation. And I wanted to say that I think we are at a very, very crucial point, and I think people need to start wrapping their heads around this, which is I think, again, we need to look towards the past. We need to recognize that before the world wars, and the world wars sort of like created this situation where unions and labor started thinking about things in more nationalistic terms. Like unions used to have an international conscience. The idea that working people all over the world had common cause and solidarity with each other. We need to rediscover that, because the fates of American workers are the same as fates around the world. And globalism, unfortunately, has pitted us against each other. And now that neoliberal globalism is coming to a juncture, I think that we have a really vital chance here to start changing the way we look at these things and start reigniting that international conscience, and realizing that with reindustrialization in the United States, as neoliberal globalism is starting to cannibalize the United States, and for a long time, and we talked about this before, the United States was on top of this ladder, where the United States was at, it had the catbird seat when it came to the consumer society. And now the check's coming due. All of a sudden, now we're going to reindustrialize. We're going to get rid of a lot of that progress, a lot of the perks that took place of neoliberal globalism at the very beginning. I think with reindustrialization, and I think in a little bit, we're probably going to have to talk about this so-called new Cold War, as we're starting to reindustrialize America, I think this is an opportunity to start looking at this system as it was crafted. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, we saw that there's going to be crinks in this global supply chain that start bringing this to its knees and start putting real pressure on people. I think we can start thinking about how we can use this system against itself and start rediscovering international solidarity and realizing that nationalism gets in the way of all this stuff, and it always has. And I think that by thinking about that and anticipating it and staying a couple of steps ahead of it, we can start to win back some of the losses that we had with neoliberal globalism and start to build something that isn't just better, but almost infinitely better than what we've been given.
Add a little something here. Corporations understand that when they fight for something against the interests of the unions or against the interests of the public, they're usually successful, at least in stalling a bill they don't want passed, or getting a regulation put in place or taken away that they favor. But they know that sooner or later they're going to lose some of these. When they lose them, they don't give up. They look for a new way around to undo the loss they've just suffered. But people who are on the other side, the working class, the union movement, we have to remember that. And yeah, you're right. If there's an attempt to unionize, the company can threaten or actually carry out the threat of leaving the United States. But that does not end the battle. Here are a couple of ways that unions could, and as Jared rightly reminds us, in the past have reacted to prevent these problems from being solved in the way the company wants. Number one, if you leave the country, Mr. Employer, we want you to know, we're the union, we're the community where you're located, whatever it is, we want you to know that we are going to launch a campaign around the United States to inform everybody in the United States what you did, how you damaged the workers whose livelihoods were destroyed, the community which was knocked down a peg, all the suffering that you did for the enhanced profit of your shareholders, who are fewer in number than the people that you hurt. I'm not sure you want us to do that, Mr. Employer. And here's number two. If you imagine you're going to go to some other country where you pay workers a fraction of what you pay them here, and then ship all that stuff back here, we're going to run a boycott. We're going to tell people, think about buying that product, because here's what that company did to bring that product to you. And here's another one. Maybe we should develop a program with local political leaders that when a company does that, we say, okay, we, the community, are going to take over that factory, that office, that store, and we're going to open it up again, only this time as a worker co-op, as a different kind of enterprise. And we're going to tell the people of the United States, you can choose. You can buy the product from the company that went and damaged us all, or you can buy that product from a company that employs local people, that maintains the local community's economic base, and so on. There are all kinds of things like that, and that's just a partial list, that allow working people to fight back rather than to say, oh, we've been bested, there's nothing more we can do. Okay, let me go on now, and we're switching to the questions that are coming in from you, the live audience. And I forgot earlier to thank you for your interest, for your participation, and for the volume of questions. I only wish we had the time to answer them all. Asmari asks, if the Federal Reserve is the largest holder of U.S. debt, why can't the United States just forgive that part of the debt to itself? That's a very good question. Let me first explain so everybody understands. When the United States government borrows money, it's because the kind of spending that it wants to do is not matched by the taxation it would have to levy on the people and the businesses to raise the money it wants to spend. But it can spend more than it raises in taxes if it can borrow the part it doesn't raise in taxes. So suppose it wants to spend $1 billion, half of it can be raised in taxes and the other half can be borrowed. Okay, that's the way this country works. And I don't mind reminding you, it leads to very crazy results, this system. One result is, since politicians want to give the public and the businesses what they want, which costs money, but they don't want to be taxed, neither the businesses nor the people, the politicians are caught in an absurd situation. They can't raise the taxes, but they must do the spending. And so the problem is solved by borrowing the difference. And that difference each year between what is spent and what it has to be borrowed is called the deficit, in case you hear that in the press. Nothing all that complicated about it. Well, here comes now the problem. When the government borrows money, it issues what's called a treasury security. A bill, a treasury bond, has different names that are not so important. It borrows the money and it gives the person who lends the money to the government, whether that's a corporation or an individual, a piece of paper. It's like an IOU, and we will pay you back in 5 years for what you've lent to the government. Okay, then a little magic happens, and this is not complicated, but it is something rarely explained to the American people. The Federal Reserve is a completely different part of the government. It does not borrow money from the public. It is not in the business of running a deficit. It doesn't do that. It has the specific restricted task of doing two things: controlling the quantity of money in circulation and, very, very important, maintaining price stability, avoiding an inflation, which right away lets you know, since we're in an inflation, that the Federal Reserve often fails to do what it was set up to do. But the Federal Reserve can change the quantity of money, and here's how it does it. It goes to the people and corporations who've lent money to the government, the Treasury of the United States that does the borrowing. The Federal Reserve goes to the people who have those IOUs and buys those IOUs from them. That's how it works. And what does the Federal Reserve use to buy the Treasury IOUs that it goes into the market to buy? The answer, it prints the money it uses to do that. That's where the money comes from. That's why we have the quantity of money in circulation, because the Federal Reserve plays this crucial role. A little footnote for those of you that imagine that the American economy could or ever did do without massive government intervention, be sure you understood what I just said. The money that makes the world go round, the money that keeps the American economy on its feet, is something controlled by the government of the United States, which has massive influence on it all the time. So the notion that we could have an economy without the government interference is a utopian fantasy that has never existed in capitalism's history. So the government of the United States finds out that in the end, the IOUs that they gave to the people and companies that lent to the government ended up in the hands of the Federal Reserve. And Asmari's question is, well, since these are both different parts of the government, couldn't they cancel it all out? And therefore the debt would be reduced. Well, the first simplest answer is they could. They could do that. They could just not pay back that money, and then the Federal Reserve wouldn't get the money, but who cares, because it can print whatever money it needs. And there are people who want that sort of thing to happen, who are interested in that. But there are others who are very much against it. And let me conclude by telling you why they're against it. It's the long history of money. Way back in ancient Egypt and ever since, there have been kings and queens, emperors and czars who used their power of controlling the money to do all kinds of things that the mass of their own people didn't want. It was a horrible tool in the hands of the governing power. So when capitalism came, it was afraid, when it replaced feudalism, to give that kind of power to, for example, the president of a country, any country. The capitalists have always been fearful of giving the power of money directly to the governmental authority. So they create a special independent entity. In most other countries, it's called the bank of that country, like the Bank of England or the Bank of France or the Bank of Japan. In our country, for historical reasons, we gave it a different name, the Federal Reserve. But the whole idea is to keep the government from having the power to print the money because it's been so abused. So we create the Federal Reserve to limit the abuse that could happen. And so we're not going to let the government, in this argument, forgive the debt. We're not going to have any of that. We are going to hold on to this system because we are terrified of the abuse and damage to American capitalism if we ever relaxed it.
And Dr. Wolff, I would just like to point out, it's an
Please.
incredibly convenient fiction. These are all stories that we tell each other for convenient purposes. For instance, debts that nations run up are fictions themselves. They can be used as carrots and sticks in order to make countries do what we want them to do in order to carry out austerity. In the United States, I always find it very charming how we don't have the money to do literally anything or give anybody any sort of a social safety net. And yet, whenever it comes time to do the next budget, we have to increase the military industrial complex. Or if one of those booms or busts that we were talking about earlier happens, it's really convenient to have the government there in order to be a bailout mechanism, which they can run up as much debt as they want as long as they're able to help out with the boom or the bust. It's very interesting how it's concrete one moment and it's malleable the next.
Right. That's why one year the deficit is the big problem that Republicans and Democrats debate. And a year later, even though the deficit has gotten bigger, it's a debt issue. Nobody's interested. And you're right. In 2008, nobody in Congress questioned that they had to give hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out the big banks and insurance companies, whereas a few years later, when it meant give another year or two of that support to unemployed people on top of their normal unemployed benefits, oh no, that has to be brought to an end. That's not a socially appropriate way of spending money. It is, once you see it, kind of outrageous.
Well,
All right,
Oh,
Go ahead.
just very quickly, because I want to build off that. Like, for people who are watching or listening to this, one of the most telling things that you can find, and Dr. Wolff, it's like it's like watching the sun come up in the morning. It's incredible that, like, when conservatives are out of power, they worry about nothing except for deficits. They have to reduce the deficit. They have to make it's for our grandchildren. Meanwhile, when they're in power, they run up deficits that are incredible, largely for tax cuts for the wealthy and also for law enforcement. And you'll also notice, and go back and make sure that you look at this, people, because you will see the pattern of it. When liberals are in power, man, they would really love to give you all those programs that they've promised and that they've campaigned on, but we just can't do it. We have to make sure that the deficit's under control. It's a wrestling match. And the convenient fiction of what debt can do and what it can't do, it changes depending upon who is in power and what those in power want to do. It is simply a completely malleable resource. That's all it is.
Yeah, but you know, it has real effects.
Sure.
We are now deeply in debt as a nation, and we have to pay interest on that debt. And let me give you an idea of the complexity. Interest rates are very high now relative to what they were in the first 20 years of this century. That means that the enormous debt in the many trillions of dollars now has to pay a higher interest rate than before, which means every year a huge part of the taxes we all pay to the government is simply used by the government to turn around and give that money as interest payments to the people who own the national debt. And here's something that you may want to think about. The second largest holder of US government debt is the People's Republic of China. And we must send them interest because they have lent that money to the United States government. So tens of billions of dollars of the taxes you and I pay are collected by Washington and then sent to Beijing for them to use in whatever way they want. That's another consequence. And most Americans have no clue what this means or what the implications of it are. All right, there's another question from Alexander. Jared, this is for you.
Let me find this one. Okay, this is Alexander asks, could you weigh in on the conversation about private equity a bit? How do we fight back against this problem? This is like one of the larger issues, because if you actually look at where we're at, it feels like political power has been completely and utterly co-opted beyond any sort of movement elsewhere. It feels intractable. It feels like one of those things where you start thinking about infinity and your brain shuts down after a while. And I think one of the things that we have to consider is, and this going back, and we were talking about labor unions and how they might be able to deal with moving jobs and plants overseas. There has to be a way to exert political pressure in order to change the consensus that we live under. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by imagining that tomorrow will look exactly like today or yesterday. We lose political imagination to think that we might have a future in which political leaders might be free of the corruption that they're under. They are certainly corrupted, not just by equity, but also the wealthy and the powerful. I think that leads to inaction. I think if we start talking about these things, we start illustrating it. I don't think most Americans are even aware of how private equity plays a role in everything. They simply sort of suffer the consequences of how these things exploit them, and they make their conditions worse. I think that we need to move conversations about private equity as well as changing the neoliberal consensus. I think we need to move that to the forefront of what we're expecting from politicians. And instead, we get a lot of culture war sort of stand-in things that ultimately sort of divide us. They keep us from having conversations that engage with solidarity and also improving matters. I think that these things have to be reined in by the powers that be. They gave them free rein in order to basically become invincible vultures in our economy. And that, as well as the reforming of the corruption that has co-opted our representatives, I think this is what should be shouted from the rooftops everywhere.
Yeah, and just to add it briefly, private equity is a procedure by which you gather together wealth from the wealthiest people and companies in the country into huge pools of money, which are then able to go and push the economy in this direction or that direction, having nothing to do with the needs of the people, having nothing to do with the demands of fairness, of democracy, none of it. It's all done to make more money. Companies and rich people give their wealth to the private equity firm, whose job it is to make a biggest profit you can, a bigger profit than that company or that rich individual could do on their own. And so you make the demand and the drive for profit an even more socially powerful force in the society. And as if it didn't matter that they now have the money and the power that goes with it to overwhelm local governments, overwhelm state governments, and in terms of what they do abroad, contradict or push the global economy in particular directions. So it's a terrible undermining of the little bit of democracy that we have left.
I just want to add on that because I think this is something that American discourse really fails to understand. A lot of the reason why this country continues to get worse and worse is something like private equity, and the way that it just comes in, just cannibalizes something and destroys it. Things that mean something to us, whether it's our jobs or pastimes, or even the places we like to go and where we like to spend our time. And then one day they'll be there, and then the next they'll just be destroyed. They'll be liquidated and ruined. And what do we get instead of an explanation from our politicians and leaders? We get conspiracy theories. It's a deep state, it's the Jews that are doing it. Whatever it is, it's these big giant conspiracies. And the reason they don't level the finger at the people responsible is because they're in bed with the people who have done it. They don't want to tell people why this has happened. And as a result, most people live in a state of mystification. They don't understand why the country has gotten worse, why their way of life has gotten worse, and why they're not able to get ahead maybe in the way they were in the past. We need to start educating people on how things are actually working in this country, as opposed to these really destructive, poisonous myths that hide what is actually occurring.
Our next question comes from California, and California asks, how do you challenge the concept of houses as an asset in the United States? When are they actually going to build affordable rent control in areas such as Huntington Beach? Well, housing is one of the great bases of any economy, and how well an economy functions can be measured by how well it houses its people. So right off here in the United States, something is wrong, because we have millions of people that are either homeless, living on outside, living in tents under highway overpasses, or are living with too many people crowded into too little a space. So we're not doing a very good job of housing our people, number one. Number two, we have a private building industry, which has reached the point now in the United States where the majority of American people cannot afford to own their own home. We hold out home as an asset that you're supposed to aspire to. We hold it up as a goal, as a measure of how successful you are, doing a real disservice to all the people that you have made it impossible to afford a home. Given what has happened to the prices of homes, given what has happened to the interest rate that determines the mortgage that you have to take out to buy a home, put that together with the salaries and wages people get, and the majority of Americans cannot afford to own their own home. Given that, a decent society would make sure that there are affordable rents as an alternative to owning your own home, that there are rents that people can afford, not just the rich, but everybody. And our society is woefully ineffective at that. Rents are crazy. They're a major issue all over the United States. Here in New York City, where I'm based, they are laughable. The rents have forced literally millions of Americans out of the city of New York, making it a place where only people with a lot of money can even think about owning a home. And that leaves then the people who have to pay exorbitant rents. Well, we know how to stop that. Here in New York City, we still have, although it's only the remnants, we still have rent control. Rent control is when the government steps in and says, we are committed as a society to make affordable apartments for everyone. And therefore, we're going to determine that rents cannot go above this. There's a rough measure in the housing market that says you cannot be asked to pay more than 25 to 30% of your income for your housing, because if you do, you're going to cut back on the other parts of a basically adequate life, your medical care, your transportation, your education costs, and so on. But we don't do it. We have the legal basis. We have the history. We know how it works. But we cannot defeat the interests of the landlords and the people who own massive amounts of housing, which, by the way, are increasingly those very equity funds that we were just talking about, who have been buying up housing in the United States. So we don't do it, but we ought to, and we have the tools, legal and otherwise, to do this. It's a question of the political will. Can the majority that would benefit from rent-controlled apartments get itself together to make that happen? That's the issue, and that will determine whether and when what California asks for will get done. All right.
On that note, I just want to say that one of the reasons that I'm actually hopeful and optimistic at this current really awful time is exactly what you just brought up. Private equity has been gobbling up single family homes, like using algorithms and the most aggressive and putrid, investment strategies you could ever imagine. And as people are starting to realize that American myth of home ownership and the middle, climbing up into the middle class and becoming a stakeholder in the American dream, they're becoming radicalized. I mean, some of the most exciting things that I'm seeing out in the world right now are tenants who suddenly are looking around and they say, not only is this unfair, but it's getting progressively and aggressively worse. And they're starting to work with each other and starting to engage in solidarity and question what has been a lie from the very beginning. So I believe that this absolutely destructive behavior by private equity when it comes to single family houses, I think is almost delivering the backlash that's going to lead toward it being, cinched in.
And there are also there's also literature now about rent strikes when tenants get together and fight against it, and they put their rent in what's called an escrow account where they don't give it to the landlord pending a resolution of the problems and difficulties. This is making the profitability for these equity funds go down. They didn't bargain with opposition. They didn't bargain with resistance. They didn't bargain with everything we're trying to talk about. And that may also slow this process so that the struggle is itself part of how you win a better set of conditions. Okay, Jared, there's a question from Mohammed. Can you deal with
Mohammed? Why is the international solidarity not usually emphasized by socialists? Why is it so difficult for unions to coordinate internationally, thus preventing companies from just moving jobs from country to country? So one of the things I like this question because I think it's something that people need to think about. I think what we have to do, first of all, unfortunately, is do a little bit of soul searching, a little bit of introspection. Globalism, neoliberal globalism, was built on the promise of cheap goods. And cheap goods, I hate to tell people, but cheap goods come from people who are being exploited. I'm sitting here hanging out with you and I'm having a great time. I have a phone right in front of me that is like one of the most impressive pieces of technology that's ever existed. The only reason that I was able to afford that was because of slave labor around the world and people who are being exploited and people who are being oppressed based on this globalist system. Unfortunately, a lot of our morality and a lot of our ethics have been bought off by the promise of cheap goods. And on top of that, it's really hard to think about the suffering that you don't necessarily see around the world. I think social media has made us aware of the plight of people. I think you look at something like Gaza and you start to see, how things actually go down, and all of a sudden you're confronted with your conscience. I think this is a moment of conscience. And I think it's a moment to realize that this deal that America was given, that we were going to get cheap goods, and we didn't have to think about who was getting hurt. We didn't have to think about how democracy was being hurt around the world and being destroyed and subjugated around the world. It's coming home now. And that's, I think, a good moment to look in the mirror and realize how this stuff has happened. And I do think that with the rise of solidarity and labor movements, we're starting to understand that our fates are interconnected in a way that we used to be told that they weren't, that it was about our individual work and we just need to keep our heads down and not worry about other people. And in fact, neoliberalism prioritizes and incentivizes sociopathic behavior, to hurt other people, to not worry about other people, to not see yourself as connected to a larger, human family. And I think before we're able to do this work and we're able to turn the tide, I think we have to look inside of ourselves and realize we've sold off other people, and we've even sold off our own economic, political, and social fates for a pittance. We've done it for hardly anything. An economy that not only doesn't treat us well, but it insults us with what it is that we traded away for that human dignity. And I think that is the building block towards actually engaging in this larger solidarity, not only across like international lines, but even state lines at this point, even across the block. And I think before we're able to gain that energy, we have to like really take a look at that and really realize that that's the building block of it.
If I could add something, even though we're running out of time, there is a deep and philosophic question that we ought to have been discussing for the last 50 years, and we haven't. Just like at the beginning of this program, we talked about things that were taboo for the last 75 years. Here's another one. You can develop the world in a way that some parts of it are very, very rich and other parts of it are very, very poor. But if you do that, you're going to have endless conflict, the same way you would in a town or a village or anywhere else where you have these kinds of radically different conditions. The people who are poor, especially if they can see, which modern telecommunications makes true for everybody, they can see how the other half or the other 5% live. They can feel angry, they can feel bitter, they can feel envious. The people who have can feel frightened that what they have is at risk and become very belligerent and very self-centered. It has horrible consequences, and the human condition has known this. You can find statements, in the Bible, in the Quran, in the holy books of virtually every religion, telling people don't allow that kind of condition. Well, capitalism fails at doing anything about that. Capitalism has produced unspeakable inequality, and nowhere more so than in the United States. 50 years ago, we were one of the least unequal countries in the world. Now we are one of the most. And where capitalism has gone elsewhere in the world, it has done the same thing. Billionaires at one end and desperately poor people at the other. If we learn that lesson, we would want to have international solidarity of governments, but also of unions, of working people, to make a change, to actually develop the world so it is less unequal, to concentrate the future investments in places that need it, so that those people feel the solidarity with the rest of us, so that the enmities and hostilities and bitterness will not happen. We are embroiled here in the United States, for example, with an enormous debate, much of it filled with cruelty, about immigrants, in which we scapegoat these poor people coming across the southern border, running away from climate disaster, poverty, war, all the things that go with unequal economic conditions. Well, guess what? if we had spent more time helping to develop Central America, South America, and the other places from which these folks come, they wouldn't be interested in migrating in the first place. We are dealing with the consequences of not dealing with the international dimension of our lives. It's not just a question of helping them, the poor. It's a question of helping us to live in a world that is a much better place if we don't have polarities of rich and poor. And it's also a matter of your conscience, your morality, and your ethics. And here they all work together to say, let's not let the profit motive determine where economic development occurs. We have a higher motive. We have a bigger stake in the kind of equalization that we could have been engaged in for the last 50 years. But first, we have to fight the battle to establish the principle. Well, folks, unfortunately, we have run out of the time we can allot to this activity. If you would like to support or donate, you can do so in two ways. And of course, there are expenses of bringing all of this to you, and we would be dishonest if we didn't tell you about it and ask your help in defraying some of these costs. And you can do it in two ways. You can go to our website, democracyatwork.info, or join our Patreon community at patreon.com, democracy at work. And you can become a monthly member, which is, of course, bet. Jared, I want to ask you also to mention how folks can follow your social media and become more acquainted with what you do.
Sure. Unfortunately, I'm still over at Twitter. I'm at JY Sexton. You can find my writings at Dispatches from a Collapsing State, and I co-host the Muckrake podcast. And yeah, everybody, thanks for coming.
Okay, folks, if you have any comments about this conjoint effort by Jared and myself, please let us know. Keep your questions coming. And I look forward to speaking with you again next time on Ask Prof Wolff. Thank you.